Joan and Alex Murray met Professor Raymond Dart in 1967. Dart cooperated in and inspired Joan and Alex's ongoing investigation into human developmental movement as it relates to the Alexander technique. They developed the Dart procedures, an innovative process that influences Alexander teaching throughout the world. Alex played principal flute in major orchestras, including the Royal Opera and the London Symphony Orchestra. He was professor of flute at Michigan State University from 1967 to 1974. Alex spent the next 3 years as professor at the Royal Dutch Conservatory in The Hague. In 1977, Alex was appointed professor of flute at the University of Illinois, a position he held until his retirement in 2002. Since then, he has devoted himself full-time to the Alexander technique. In 2015, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award of the National Flute Association. In September of 2018, Joan and Alex were given the Illinois Arts Legacy Award. Alex, thank you for meeting up today and sharing your thoughts. I know this is going to be fascinating. My first question is, could you tell us who introduced you to the Alexander technique and what were your first impressions?
Charles was in with the medical profession. As you may know, I've got a pamphlet that was called Poise and Relaxation, written by Charles Neal and published in the early 50s, during which time Alexander was persona non grata, and Charles managed to teach something vaguely resembling the Alexander technique, called Poise and Relaxation. It was more relaxation than anything else, but it was still basically sort of Alexander. And my friend, who had terrible scoliosis, was worked on by Charles and made relatively flexible. And his wife she was horrified when Charles started working, on their own. But once you worked with him, she couldn't believe it. I was having problems with bronchitis in those days, in playing in the pit in Covent Garden, all kinds of reasons that contributed to that. And he said, I think it'll help you with your breathing.
My next question is, how did you and Joan meet?
Actually, we met because she was in The King and I. Annabelle Farjon, who was the New Statesman dance critic, was there.
Right.
And she wrote it up and said what a good dancer Joan was.
Uh-huh.
Was the only one who got any notice. So we were doing it a second time, a week later. I cut it out and gave it to her. That was when we first sort of met. We had her mother was with her, and we had a drink of orange juice, which is all I drank in those days. Still is actually. So, and then, after that, a month or two later, there was Callis was playing at Covent Garden, and I saw Joan in the line to get tickets. And I said, you're not going to have much luck, because I knew they were all sold out. I said, I'll see if I can see the orchestral manager and see if I can get you in somehow. And she was getting it for a friend. And I looked, he wasn't there at the time, so I was going in. I didn't think too much about what we were doing. I said, I'll see you after the show. What time do you finish? I think she finished at 10:15 or something. Well, as luck would have it, was Go to Devil.
Oh,
and it went on till 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And Valhalla came tumbling down.
Yeah.
She was waiting for me, and there it was, all going over and over with the Wagnerian finish. And we met very late, but we managed to get a coffee together after that, and then we met again later. And after that, I went on a cycle ride to Munich, down the Rhine, with a couple of friends from horn players from college, and I wrote cards to Joan there at the stage door, and then we came back. We got together and we went to Obraztsov, and there was a Russian puppet show that was over, and various Russian dance companies that came over.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a member of the Society for Cultural Relations with the Soviet Union, And so I knew what was on.
Yeah.
And I was also learning Russian. And so that's when we got back, and it was a month or so later we got married in October.
Wonderful.
We'd only sort of met in the spring, but we hadn't really done much courting because we were both working. And then it's a picture of us, a wedding photo that my mother caught somebody outside the Kensington Registry Office who was taking photos, got him to take us, otherwise we wouldn't have had a photo. And my daughter had it framed, it's stuck around the corner there.
So at this time when you were newlywed, you
Yes.
were both having Alexander lessons with Charles Neal. Yeah.
Joan was critical, but she was in his class with Graham Fagg, Rika Cohen, Rika Mashulan in those days,
Yeah.
before she was married.
So when you say in his class, you mean
Yes, he had
the
a
training?
he had a
or
had a training class,
yes.
which was when it was a time when they could all get together. And Graham Fagg was a doctor working with young kids, and he wrote a book about it eventually. When Joan got Fair Lady, that was spectacular. You know, this was going to be the show, which it certainly was for 4 years. Charles wanted to have a photo of her to advertise Charles Neal, you see,
Understandable.
his place. And shortly after asking, he died.
Joan was training with Charles Neal, but you were not at the time?
No, I would go along. I had lots of lessons with him because I was so busy. So when I had time off, I'd go there.
Yep.
But then we went to Walter because Irene Tasker, when Charles died, Irene recommended Walter to Rika. And she recommended us to it. But Joan had had enough of what Charles had been doing, which was directing attention to one's sitting on your haunches and directing attention to my buttocks, as Rika used to say, and directing attention to my buttocks. And she was off the hook. But Walter called up and said, would she like to? And she hadn't thought about it. But because she was at Drury Lane and he was at Stayflex House, wasn't very far, and he put himself out and gave her a lesson on a Saturday. And she said, this is very different from Charles. You know, and that's all she said. And so she then thought, well, I thought, you go into his class, which was held there. And I went in there to see what was going on, as I did, and then I started having lessons there, but I found that I got on very well with John Skinner, who said he didn't know what the technique was about, and I think he was quite right. But then so did a lot of other people who are claiming to teach it, but he was not claiming what he didn't know. Walter was just inhibiting, directing, and taking people up as best he could. And Joan had never been lifted out of her bag. She was very flexible because she was acrobatic. And the beginning of Fair Lady was she was doing acrobatics in, heavy dress. And so that she started there. And I can tell you, when I walked in, and they were sitting in Alexander fashion like this, Lady Ben was sitting there like this, looking like that. I picked up a cushion and threw it at her. And she just horrified her, because what I'd understood from Charles was this was about keeping your wits about you, of being alert, not about being right. Although Charles had, when he had a class, when I'd gone in as a victim, to have his, and he said, what would you say about this young man? He asked me to sit and stand or something. And nobody had anything useful to say, really. I can't remember, but what I do remember was he said, well, he's a young man who's trying to be right. And, and told this to my colleague, psychophysiologist, he said, there's no right to tell you that. That's not something you say if you're psychologist or whatever, you don't say things to people like that. He said, no, he's got no right to say that. Well, it didn't bother me. And looking back 60 years later, he was right, but you're always trying to be right.
Fascinating. Thank you. Could we move on to talking about the connections that you see between Alexander's discoveries and childhood development?
Alexander took a long time to find out he had problems with his breathing, and that it wasn't surprising because he didn't breathe normally at birth. He was premature, and mature babies suck their thumbs in the last trimester. And this has been demonstrated, things that Dart told me to look out for. The 12 cranial nerves. When you're a baby, John Dewey wrote a beautiful chapter, third part of his How We Think, in 1910, before he met Alexander. He said, people will ask, what's the baby thinking? Well, the baby's not thinking anything. There's not a cortex there. All the baby's concerned with is getting fed when it needs it and being comfortable. As Dart said, you've got to go back as far as you can. That's why he said fetal's the most important. In the fetal, you're sucking your thumb, you're folded up, and everything's taken care of, and as soon as you're born, you breathe. The next thing you do, you've got to be fed. When you're fed, and there's a book on brain development in early childhood, and you can't look at early childhood development of a baby without looking at baby and mother. It describes sucking as being taken care of by the midbrain. It's not the cortex. But the respiratory center, which establishes a rhythm as soon as you're born, as soon as you take your first breath, then it goes on. And the next thing, as soon as you suck, all 12 cranial nerves are involved, but including, of course, the vagus. But startle stops it all. If you drop a baby, it startles. That's the only thing that causes startle in a newborn.
Thank you, Alex. Now, I wonder if you could give us your insight into the influence of vision on infant development.
The head moves in human beings in order to extend the range of vision. To better his vision, man became completely upright. Now, you look at this, see there, I think there are a couple of places, it's not entirely, I think here we are. There we are. It knows there's a mirror up there, you see. It's there. It's getting up. It's getting up and it's beginning to see there. Its eyes have got in there and sees there. But this is a wonderful one because there you see what all of us see. If you want to know when is your head, when is your line of sight in the best possible place, when you look in the mirror and you see your eyes. If the mirror's, that mirror won't do it because it's bent. But when it's right in front of you, your eyes are there. When I look there, that's my line of sight. I can lift my eyes and I can see 30 degrees up. I can look down and see 60 degrees down. Roughly, that's the movement of the eyes. But only after 6 months or so do the eyes actually focus. Before that, the eyes are rolling around. And in an early child, there's a 3-month one here, I think, 4-month-old baby, to see the world spirals, but you can see the eyes are not really seeing, it's sucking its thumb, it's seeing things. But at 6 months, 9 months there, but rolling over at 6 months, you can see it's got a toy, it can see the toy. When you can see with both eyes, when they focus instead of rolling, then that's the institutes, and all this comes with Dart's work there, they call it cortical thumb, because if you can do that and take hold of something between you point at something, you see, and you take hold of it, your thumb is cortically operated. The cortex is operating. Before that, the eyes don't leave the head. After that, the eyes leave the head. When you look to the right, you turn there. You look to the left, turn there. Look up, look down. You have that whole range of vision.
You're saying there's a difference in the development process when the eyes leave the head.
Yes.
To when the head turns independently of the eyes.
Yes, when the head's just one of those things that moves. And this is the thing, you see, and this is what I use when working on the table. When you're a small child, you can find your mouth with your thumb. But so can we. This is something we haven't lost. But you also find your mouth with your big toe. And small children find their mouths with their big toes. And we had a pupil who had a 7-month-old child, and when I said that to her, I want you to think of putting your big toe in your mouth when you're lying on the table. That's the movement up, and then you put your leg down, and then you've directed thought, and you've gone back. Just as fetal is when I collapse here, I'm going back as far as I can to make myself comfortable. And some parts of me are sort of stiff from 90 years of whatever, but a baby would really just be bare. His head would go out. That would be comfortable. It's not comfortable for me. But I mean, but I can, if I'm just sitting here, not pontificating, well, I'm pontificating all right, but this is great. And the thing is, you see, I can imagine an Alexander interview. Yes, the first Alexander meeting I went to, where there were 30 people, the stat. Walter had joined. He decided if you can't beat him, join him. That's right. That's what he said. And they came in, and the front row was empty, of course. Everybody sat down from the back forwards, And so the last people in had to walk to the front, and they walked like the zombies, Well, the funny thing is, the story is that the char ladies in the elevator in Brighton, when they had the meeting there, said, what's all this? What are they all here for? I don't know, they've got stiff necks. That's brilliant.
Alex, the Dart procedures, the Dart work, Raymond Dart's work, is obviously very important to you. And
what was so important about Dart was it came to me because Frank's work was the first time I took an interest in the Alexander technique was when Frank wrote his papers. I thought, well, here's somebody who's taking it seriously and doing something.
Frank Fitzjones.
And he showed the photo of different trajectory with somebody guided and not guided. And then he described the mechanism. It's all in the book. And one of the things I liked about your book is that you quote Frank and you recommend his book, which I've always, because actually we persuaded him to write it.
All right.
Well,
thank you for that.
We got Peggy, who was staying with us in Interlochen at the time, to talk to him on the phone and say, this is great, I had two chapters, and she said, oh, please go on with this. And he went on with it. Otherwise, he didn't think anyone would want it.
How do you think someone should start learning about the Alexander technique?
You've got to meet somebody who says, I know the thing for you, and it's simple. Where's your head and where's the ground? If you don't know that, you can't begin.
Right.
And as soon as you know it and accept that, you can get started.
And could you describe what one might call good use?
It's there in a healthy newborn, developing normally, And it only goes wrong when habits come in. When you go to school and you learn to sit and be bored, and not because you're curious. If you're in school and you're curious, you're pulling wings off a fly or something like that, the teacher says, sit up, you're not paying attention, then you're in trouble. And then from then on, you're bored. You don't teach anyone anything. See, I taught myself the penny whistle, and then when I saw a recorder in a music shop, it was a wooden one, I thought, oh, wooden penny whistle, but I couldn't afford it. And I looked in a junk shop and I found a fife, and I found that had 6 holes in the hole here, and I picked it up and started to play it. And when I got to South Africa as an 11-year-old with the evacuees, I was 300 of us, the Cape Town Orchestra played for us, we were in quarantine, and the second flute was, David Sandman was only 10 years older than me, he was 21, he'd just come out, and he gave me a flute, actually, lent it first, gave it to me, the flute he'd used as a boy, the Boozy and Hawks one, not particularly good, but it played, and he showed me the fingerings, and I found, oh, you can play any tune in any key, if you find the way, and that's how, and he said to Joan, because he used a tutor with me, which had a different scale each week, and he just showed me the fingering, that was it. And I couldn't read to begin with, but I learnt when the fingers do this, it's that sound and this note, and I taught myself to read through the flute. Gareth, when he played the flute, was thinking notes, he wasn't just thinking and that. And I had his book when it came out, 40 years later of teaching. He wrote a book, the Oxford Press. I got it in America and glanced at it and thought, well, that's for Gareth. People want like Gareth, that's Gareth. He was very fussy about quality of music. Well, he's quite right about that. But when I read carefully what he described, he didn't say any of the things he'd said I had to do. But my problem wasn't that I had to do them, that I had tried too hard. Because what he wanted me to do was change where I put my tongue, instead of touching the back of the teeth there, on the roof of the mouth and going, Ka. Now, when working it out myself, you see, I can put the tongue anywhere I like. If it's on the roof of the mouth, I can take it away and go, Da. It's no problem, but if I go,
Yes.
then I stutter. I got a stutter on T's. I couldn't say T because I wasn't saying it like I normally do it, and it wasn't normal on the flute, it was different, but for him you wanted, and that was with this, I was sort of, everything stopped. Well, what stops? What's the first sign of distress? You hold your breath. Now, Rachel Zahn, whom you may or may not be familiar with, because she brought together neuroscientists and the Alexander Technique, and Neil Roberts, who's a great friend of ours, came down from Edinburgh, he still comes. He's into fMRIs, but she was in Paris she wanted to get hold of Berthoz, who was a pupil of who was working with Russians, who were with Nikolai Bernstein, who got a Stalin Prize for working on Stakhanov and what was skill in using a hammer. But he found you can't measure the skill on the hammer, it's in a circuit in the brain, so he got into the brain, and this is, Rachel wanted the Alexander Technique to be examined when people are thinking, inhibiting, or whatever. Her description of the Alexander Technique, which was with Judy Leibovitz, was just, she lay there and Judy took her head for half an hour, and that was it. She had never felt, she'd had twitches before, and this was the beginning, and that's what she thought the technique was on. Well, Stat obviously thought putting photographs of people with their knees up was advertising the Alexander technique. Well, it isn't the technique. That was, Alexander said to Irene, give them a lie on the floor, give them a lie down before they go, because he'd been bullying them, and when people were, he could see, he told Dewey and he told Irene, I want you to sit. No, I don't want you to sit. And they, what the hell does he mean? You know, both of them discussed it. The inhibition was the hardest thing. He knew, he wanted them not to do something, but how do you get somebody not to, don't think of a pink elephant, you know? And he never learned, but if you, that's why I put together all the information I could find on his different steps. He didn't discover the Alexander technique. He worked on himself, he screwed himself up more, learning to breathe, and then he discovered that when you don't breathe, you breathe. But once he discovered that, he realized that certain other conditions had to be there, because if you're like that, if you're consumptive and you're like that, you don't have much movement. So if you can get somebody to come out of that, how he did that, he describes it in relatively simple terms. Matchstick figures he used to do it for me. I could see what he meant when he's saying, but you can tell, I got the picture of sitting and standing. It was how I got 300 musicians to see what it was about. When they came and sat in the back of the hall and were told that I was going to talk about the technique, and they had to sign out when they went out because it's compulsory. I said, if you don't want to hear this, please go away and sign out. I don't want you here. If you want to hear, come down to the front. And they all came down to the front, and they went back to early childhood, and they all sat down like this. You know, there were comfortable chairs. It was a big hall, and I said, hands up. You're all wind players, yes. Hands up if you play your instrument the way you're sitting now. No. I said, well, stand up. And they stood up. So would you stand? Yes, they play now. What's the difference? Now, that's all it is, really. Well, when you're up, you're up. And if you're interested, and if you're going to play, if you're a marching band, you're going to march, so you're there. But if you're a resentful player, or if you're a scared newcomer, you know, playing for Gareth Morris, you know, I wasn't scared. I was cocky. I'd got the ARCM in my first term at college, you know, and so I could play the flute, so I thought. I was in an orchestra, Ernest Reed's London Senior Orchestra, and he said, you ought to hear Gareth Morris. He sounds like a trombone, which I didn't. My uncle didn't want to hear the flute, so I played quietly. And I still do, because I play even quietly now. But playing loudly was a problem, but I had to work it out. The technique, what I discovered was, when Alexander discovered full chest breathing, your thorax only moves freely when you're up. And it moves freer when you're up and not standing to attention, you know, military fashion. If you're just standing up, you've got more movement in your thorax. There are things you can do to help that. And I was told, this is where you can get the wrong impression from the technique, told by Walter, keep your chest down, don't raise your chest. Well, when I started experimenting with doing a whispered R and using my ears, if I make the same sound that way and that way, it fills me up here and it changes my voice and it raises my chest, because the air goes in, if I don't stop it, farther. And it just happens. I can do that when I need it, but I don't need it talking to you here. I don't need a lot of air.
I remember you mentioned once about l'après-midi.
Yes, that's it.
And taking the in-breath as if it was a whispered R.
Yeah.
And that making all the difference.
Yes, because I was asked to play in one breath. Whereas before, I recorded it when I was 30, 1960, 59, with Malta, and I took a little sneak. But got out a conductor, minor one in Urbana, who said, I like it all in one. I said, oh, well, I'll conduct it all in one and you play it all in one. You know? But so I pumped myself up. I hadn't discovered that. Then, and I did a lot of whispered R's. I hyperventilated, and when you do that, and then eventually you're taking more air. But I don't like to play like that. I like to play naturally. And that was it. And that's in the back of, if you've got a copy of my book, if you haven't, I've got a few copies coming from America, but I only have one copy at the moment. Alexander's Way. It's in my own personal story at the end. But Alexander's Way, as far as I'm concerned, is the process that Alexander went through. And I've followed that some way. And I saw it in John Dewey. And this is the one thing I must say before, that Dewey wrote a wonderful in How We Think. He says, people will ask, what's the baby thinking? Not thinking anything. But it's got to learn how to move, how to use its hands, its eyes, its ears, its nose, everything in the first years of its life. It learns that. It doesn't learn it from somebody teaching it. It picks it up.
So
and it picks up its movements. And it's only when it starts to be taught them by somebody. Once you're talking, then you're at the mercy of the people who talk to you.
I get the impression you think you cannot teach anybody anything.
No, you've got to learn it.
You can help them.
You can put something, you can give them a penny whistle, and they might learn it.
And
But if it's not there, they're not going to learn it. I'd ask if I could put my hand on them, and I'd touch them in the ribs, and say, now, you're breathing in, you're breathing out. And I'm not doing any of that. My fingers are there because my fingers tell movement. Now, if you've got somebody there who's anxious to learn, they're not breathing, You just say, just breathe normally. You say, now, do you realize that's your rhythm? If it's boom, boom, or whatever. And if I'm doing that, I wouldn't notice it. But I don't notice I don't bother with my own breathing, but I know that I'm not holding it. And all I'm doing is notice the movement in my fingertips. And these are the most sensitive part. And to Dart, this and the atlanto-occipital joint, there's no skin area there. Skin area there is C2, C3, 4, 5, C, but C1 there, the nearest is the pads of your feet, the pads of your fingers. That's the nearest connection you have. So you've got a connection between that and the ground. And if you don't have legs, and this is one of the things I point out, I can imagine someone singing without arms, singing without legs, and singing without either, if they had a head, neck and back. If the thorax was working, they could sing. Probably you won't find that, but I've seen somebody play the trumpet with their feet who didn't have arms in a circus. When I was a boy, I saw it in South Africa. And so I know that that's possible, that the feet can be like hands if you have to use them that way.
Yeah.
And that's why, since at an early stage of our development, we can do this and still do it. I think we can all do that. But we can't do that. I can't get anywhere near it. But it was there once, just as the fetal position was there. And when you sink into a soft chair, let go and let go, as they say. You don't have to sit up because you had Alexander lessons, and that's where this is not the technique. And when you see it, it's not there. Yes, where Dart, he said, you learn the most from things that are wrong. And that's what we've got to do, is learn by our mistakes.
Absolutely, sounds like the Alexander technique.
Absolutely, yes. And then if you don't like it, don't do it.
Yeah.
And that's inhibition.
Yeah. Alex, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's been very, very good to hear.